She said "I do" to a 72-year-old billionaire to save her family. But at the altar, she realized he didn't choose her by chance. It wasn't a marriage, but part of a revenge that began long before she was born. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story, and write in the comments what city you're from. I wonder where you're watching from. The rain hadn't let up for 3 days. A gray drizzle clung to the sidewalks of Savannah, turning fallen leaves to soggy paper and blurring streetlights into ghosts behind fogged glass. Claire Reeves walked quickly, with her hood pulled up and her shoulders hunched, trying to avoid the puddles she couldn't afford to replace her shoes over. Her backpack weighed more than usual, crammed with anatomy textbooks, a half-empty bottle of generic painkillers, and unopened bills. At 23, she had mastered the art of moving forward without knowing where she was going. Not out of recklessness, but because there were no other directions left. Her shift at the diner had run long again. The tips were worse than usual. And that morning, the electricity in her mother's apartment had finally been cut off. No lights, no microwave, no nebulizer. Her little sister had called in tears, saying the financial office at the community college was threatening to drop her from classes if the next payment didn't come in. Claire didn't tell her that she was behind on her own tuition, too. There wasn't any point. She reached the bus stop just as the shelter emptied out. Her breath fogged in the chilled air. The rain had turned colder. The lights of the city reflected slick and uncertain in the puddles, and when her phone rang, she didn't recognize the number. She answered it anyway, if only to feel less alone. "Claire Reeves speaking?" A man's voice responded, polite and clipped. "Miss Reeves, my name is Bernard. I represent Mr. James Kingsley. He'd like to speak with you, in person." Claire frowned. "I'm sorry, who?" "You may not know the name, but I assure you he knows yours. Mr. Kingsley believes he can help with your current difficulties." "Did someone give you my number?" "He prefers not to discuss details on the phone," the man said. "If you're willing to meet, he'll explain everything." Discreetly. At 6 o'clock. The tea room on Whitaker Street. Her first instinct was to say no. She was tired, wet, and suspicious of strange men offering help with vague promises, but something in his voice, calm, confident, and oddly precise, made her hesitate. "This isn't a scam," Bernard said, as if reading her thoughts. "You won't be asked for money, only your time." Against every instinct, Claire said she'd come. By the time she arrived at the tea room, she was soaked through despite her jacket. The place looked like it had been airlifted out of another century. Heavy velvet curtains, polished silverware, quiet music, and the smell of loose-leaf teas steeping in porcelain pots. A hostess greeted her by name and led her to a secluded booth in the back, where a man was already seated, sipping from a china cup. James Kingsley didn't look like a man who spent his evenings meeting strangers. He looked like someone who had ruled boardrooms and government committees, who had watched fortunes grow and disappear without blinking. His white hair was neatly groomed, his suit tailored to perfection. He rose slowly as she approached. "Miss Reeves," he said, "thank you for coming." Claire slid into the seat across from him cautiously. "I didn't know I had much choice." "There is always a choice," he said smoothly, "but desperation narrows them." "Why am I here?" He studied her in silence for a moment, then reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. Claire unfolded it, confused, until she recognized the heading. "Marital agreement?" she read aloud, eyebrows knitting. "Correct," Kingsley said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I am offering you a business proposition, Miss Reeves." A contract legally binding. You become my wife. I, in turn, eliminate your debt, secure your family's immediate financial future, and provide you with resources you could never access otherwise. She stared at him. Is this a joke? No, and I would appreciate you not wasting either of our time by treating it as such. Claire blinked. You're serious? Completely. This is insane. You don't know me. I don't know you. He sipped his tea. I know enough. You're 23 years old, top of your class at the local university, until you had to reduce your hours to support your mother. Your father passed 3 years ago, leaving substantial debt. Your sister is on the verge of being expelled from her program due to unpaid tuition. You work 2 part-time jobs. You're overwhelmed, exhausted, and running out of options. And marrying you solves that? It changes everything, he said. At least on paper. That is all I require. A wife, in name, in contract, not in sentiment. There will be no expectation of physical relationship. You will have access to the estate, financial security, and discretion. And in return, I gain something necessary for my own interests. She didn't respond right away. Her hands were trembling slightly, and not from the cold. The offer was so surreal that it felt theatrical, like something from a book or a very old movie. But he wasn't joking. There was no laughter in his expression, only steel. I don't need affection, he continued. I need control, a legacy, stability. I spent my life building an empire. I intend to decide who inherits it and who does not. A wife offers me advantages. That's all this is. Claire's voice was barely audible. Why me? You're unattached, intelligent, capable of discretion. You're desperate, but not foolish. That's a rare balance. She shoved the paper back across the table. I can't do this. This is sick. He didn't look offended. Then don't. But if you change your mind, my offer remains open for 48 hours. I'm not for sale. No, he said, but like anyone else, you can be rented under the right circumstances. She left in a blur of anger and confusion, the air outside colder than she remembered. Her mother was waiting at home, wrapped in blankets, their apartment lit by battery-powered lamps. Claire sat at the kitchen table, telling her everything in a whisper, as if saying it too loudly might make it real. Her mother listened without interruption. When Claire was done, she looked down at her hands and said softly, What did he promise? Claire hesitated. To erase everything, all the debt, all the fear. And you believe him? I don't know. Her mother nodded. But he can do it? Yes. Her voice cracked. Then maybe it's worth considering. Claire stared at her. You want me to marry a 72-year-old stranger? I want you to stop drowning. I want to see my daughters live past this. I don't care how strange the lifeboat looks, Claire. If it floats, you get in. She didn't sleep that night. She stared at the contract, at the list of debts, at the photographs of her father, her sister, her mother before the diagnosis, at her own reflection in the dark window pane, haunted, hollow-eyed, exhausted beyond words. By morning, her decision was made. She met Kingsley again at the tea room. He was reading a newspaper, unmoved. Well, he asked without looking up. I'll do it. He folded the paper. Good. The wedding will be small, quiet, legal. You'll receive the first transfer after the ceremony. Claire signed the document with a pen that cost more than her monthly rent. Her hands didn't shake this time. A week later, she stood in a civil courthouse wearing a cream dress tailored by someone else's assistant, saying vows written by a stranger, next to a man who had turned her life into an equation. When the officiant declared them husband and wife, James turned to her with a slight smile and said, Welcome to the rest of your life, Mrs. Kingsley. She nodded, too numb to reply. As they walked out into the rain, Claire caught a glimpse of herself in a puddle, wet, quiet, and wearing a ring that wasn't hers. She didn't know if she had saved herself or stepped into a cage with golden bars. All she knew was that she had said yes, and there was no going back. The car that waited outside the courthouse was long, black, and so polished that the wet light of the drizzle shimmered across its surface like oil on water. Claire stepped into it without a word, the weight of the platinum ring on her finger suddenly unbearable. She didn't look at James as he slid in beside her, didn't speak when the door shut with a gentle click, muffling the sound of the outside world. The driver pulled away, and the city fell behind them like a curtain drawn closed. Inside, the silence between them was thick and strangely intimate, like the moment after a confession neither person knows how to respond to. James sat with one leg crossed over the other, his hands folded neatly on his knee, his gaze out the window. Claire kept her eyes on her lap. She could still hear the judge's voice in her ears, monotone and sterile, announcing the legal bond that had just been forged between two strangers, husband and wife. A title she hadn't even tried on in her mind, much less in practice. She half expected James to say something about arrangements, expectations, appearances, but he didn't. When he finally spoke, it was to the driver. "Take us home, through the east gate." The word home landed oddly. Claire had none. Her family's apartment was a fragile space held together with late fees and dying light bulbs. The idea that she was now being delivered to someone else's version of permanence felt surreal, like being cast into a play without knowing her lines. The ride lasted nearly 40 minutes, winding through the outskirts of the city and into the countryside where the road narrowed and the trees grew denser. Claire glanced up as iron gates appeared ahead, bearing the stylized initials JK in antique lettering. They creaked open as the car approached. Beyond them, a long gravel drive stretched toward a house that didn't look real. It was massive, easily 3 stories, built in the style of old Southern estates, with stone columns, arched windows, and symmetrical wings that extended on either side like arms prepared to encircle something. But despite its grandeur, there was something cold about it. The windows reflected the gray sky, dark and vacant. The hedges were trimmed too precisely, the front steps scrubbed too clean. It didn't feel lived in, it felt preserved. Claire stepped out as the driver opened her door. Her heels crunched on the gravel. The air was thick with the scent of rain-soaked earth and something else. Something metallic, like silver locked in a drawer too long. She turned to see James already at the top of the stairs, waiting for her. "Welcome, Mrs. Kingsley," he said with a formality that made her skin prickle. Inside, the foyer was vast. The floor gleamed with polished marble veined like bone. A chandelier hung from the ceiling, throwing crystalline shadows onto the high walls. The house smelled faintly of lavender and cedarwood, sterile and elegant. There were no photographs, no signs of warmth or disorder. It was the kind of house you'd see in magazines, flawless, untouched, and utterly soulless. A woman appeared at the edge of Claire's vision. Middle-aged in a gray uniform, her hands clasped before her. "Mrs. Kingsley," she said with a shallow nod. "I'm Ingrid, head of household staff. If you need anything, I'm available. Dinner is served at 7 sharp." Claire nodded, unsure what else to say. James gestured to the staircase. "Your room is on the 2nd floor. First door to the left. You'll find everything prepared. If anything is missing, inform Ingrid." She followed the silent woman up the grand staircase. Each step echoed faintly, the sound swallowed by the velvet drapes and the emptiness. Her room was large, larger than the apartment she'd grown up in, with a four-poster bed dressed in cream linens, a fireplace that looked ornamental more than functional, and windows that stretched from floor to ceiling, though the view outside was only mist and manicured hedges. There was no lock on the door. Claire sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, staring at her reflection in the mirror across the room. She looked like a ghost of someone else, pale, cautious, too still. The ring on her finger glinted under the chandelier light. She thought of her mother's face, tired but hopeful, and her sister's tearful gratitude when Claire told her the tuition had been covered. That morning felt like another life. At 7 sharp, she descended to the dining room. It was just as grand as the foyer, with a long polished table that could seat 20. James sat at the head, reading a newspaper. He didn't rise as she entered, only nodded toward the chair to his right. Dinner was brought out in quiet courses: roasted duck, glazed carrots, something with truffle oil she couldn't identify. Everything was plated like art. The staff moved like ghosts, silent and precise. James finally looked up. "I trust the accommodations meet your standards?" Claire hesitated. "Yes, they're beautiful." "You'll adjust." He said it like a command, not a comfort. "Do you eat like this every night?" she asked quietly, unsure why the question came out. "No," he said. "Usually I eat alone." "Why now?" "Because I'm no longer alone. Legally, at least." She stared at her plate, unsure how to respond. "You don't need to perform, Claire," he added after a pause. "This isn't theater. I don't expect conversation unless you want to give it." "What do you expect?" He dabbed his mouth with a linen napkin. "Discretion, stability, presence when it matters, nothing more." "And what do I get in return?" "Security, freedom from your former burdens, and time to become whoever you choose, within reason." It sounded rehearsed, practiced, like he'd said it before to someone else. "You've done this before," she said suddenly, the thought too sharp to hold in. He didn't flinch. "Not quite like this." After dinner, he returned to his study without a word. Ingrid appeared at Claire's side, her expression unreadable. "Would you like anything before bed, ma'am?" "No," Claire said. "Thank you." Ingrid gave a slight bow and vanished. That night, Claire lay in the wide bed staring at the ceiling. She hadn't turned on the television. There was one, sleek and nearly invisible behind the paneling, but noise wouldn't help. She thought of the contract tucked away in the drawer beside her, of the exact wording, of how it hadn't once mentioned the word love. She drifted to sleep sometime before dawn and awoke to silence. The next few days followed a rhythm that felt rehearsed. James kept to his wing of the house, his movements precise, his routines etched into the structure like grooves. Claire explored when she could. The house was filled with rooms that felt like displays. A music room with a silent grand piano, a library that smelled of old bindings and untouched air, a gallery of portraits that seemed to watch her with quiet judgment. But what unsettled her most were the locked doors. There were several, heavy, with brass handles and no markings. When she asked Ingrid, the woman only said, "Private, ma'am," with a tight smile. One afternoon, she passed 2 maids in the hallway, their voices hushed. They quieted when they saw her, but not before she caught a phrase. "She doesn't know." Later, another staff member, a gardener perhaps, said quietly to a colleague, "This one's different, but he always chooses carefully." Claire began to watch James more closely. There was something about the way he moved, the way he seemed to exist only in pieces, never fully there, never quite present. She couldn't shake the feeling that she'd been slotted into a role long prepared. that someone else had played it before her. One evening, she wandered into the library and found a drawer in the desk slightly ajar. She hesitated, then pulled it open. Inside was a small key, ornate, old-fashioned, with a looped handle and notches that looked handmade. She slipped it into her pocket without understanding why. That night, she stood before one of the locked doors at the far end of the west hallway. The key was warm from her palm. She inserted it slowly, heart pounding. The lock clicked. Claire pushed the door open. The room beyond smelled like dust and memory. The wallpaper had begun to peel. The curtains were drawn. On a side table sat framed photographs, black and white, faded. One of them showed a younger James standing beside a woman with sharp eyes and a cold smile. Another photo featured two men shaking hands. One of them, Claire realized with a sick lurch, was her father. She stepped closer. On the desk was a leather-bound journal. She opened it. The first entry was dated 30 years ago. I will make them pay. One day, when no one sees it coming, I'll take back everything I lost. Claire turned the page, then another. Her father's name appeared again and again, not just as an acquaintance, but as an enemy. She felt the chill seep into her skin. James Kingsley hadn't chosen her for convenience. He had chosen her for revenge. Claire stood frozen in the threshold, the key still warm in her palm, the weight of the journal open on the desk, anchoring her like lead. Dust floated through a shaft of light cast by the barely drawn curtains, and the silence of the room pressed against her eardrums like cotton soaked in old secrets. It wasn't just the mention of her father's name that unsettled her. It was the fury laced through every sentence, the obsession embedded in every word of James Kingsley's writing. He had not merely been betrayed by the past, he had made a religion out of it. She ran her fingers lightly across the pages, scanning more entries. Each was dated, some scribbled in haste, others written with slow, methodical precision. Her father's name, David Reeves, appeared again and again, sometimes in cursive rage, sometimes underlined. One passage chilled her more than the rest. He thought I would forget. That time would wash away what he did. But I do not forget. I do not forgive. When the right moment comes, I will find a way to make him watch everything he built collapse, from beneath his daughter's name. Claire's breath caught. The room tilted slightly, and she braced herself on the edge of the desk. It had never been about her. She was a vessel, a means to an end, and James had orchestrated this entire performance with the steady hand of someone who'd rehearsed revenge for decades. She snapped the journal shut and stepped back, her hands trembling. There were more papers on the desk, legal documents, old deeds, correspondence in crisp envelopes. One in particular bore the seal of the Kingsley Foundation and the header of a private law firm. Claire pulled it closer, reading the details slowly. It outlined a transfer of significant assets, real estate, financial holdings, stocks, to a new marital trust. Her name was on it. The dates suggested it had been prepared well in advance of their wedding. She'd been mapped into his legacy long before she ever met him. A voice behind her made her jump. "Enjoying yourself?" She spun around. James stood in the doorway, the light from the hall behind him casting his silhouette into sharp relief. He didn't look angry. He looked expectant, like a professor waiting for a student to explain a wrong answer. Claire forced herself to speak. "How long were you standing there?" "Long enough to know you've discovered what I allowed you to find." "You wanted me to see this?" "I knew you'd find it eventually. You're not stupid. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. And I counted on that. "Why?" she asked, her voice low, brittle. He moved closer, his hands clasped behind his back. "Because now we can speak honestly." Claire backed away instinctively. Honesty isn't what this marriage was built on. "Contracts rarely are," he said with a shrug, "but honesty, that's more valuable than affection, more dangerous too." She stared at him, trying to reconcile the man she'd married, controlled, polite, meticulous, with the one whose words bled rage across parchment. "This was never about companionship. You wanted revenge. You married me to hurt someone who's been dead for years." He tilted his head slightly. "Is it still revenge if the debt remains unpaid?" "My father made mistakes," she snapped, "but I'm not him." "And yet," James said calmly, "his blood runs in you. His name carried your education. His choices carved the path that brought you here. No, you brought me here, with lies and manipulation." He raised an eyebrow. "Did I lie? I offered you security. You accepted. I never promised love. I never promised anything beyond what was written in black and white. That contract was a weapon." "No," he said, "it was an opportunity. You took it because you had no better options, and now you live in a house with silk sheets and no overdue bills. You're not a prisoner, Claire. You're a partner." She flinched at that word. Partners tell the truth. They also protect what they've built. You've benefited from this arrangement as much as I have. Claire took a breath, steadying herself. "That ends now." He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "What do you think you're going to do?" "Leave. Report this. Find a way to invalidate the contract. You think any lawyer will believe a young woman who entered a marriage contract of her own volition, benefited financially from it, and then changed her mind? If it was based on fraud, yes." "Careful," he said quietly. "Accusing me of fraud has consequences." "And threatening me doesn't?" she snapped. "You've spent years planning to punish a dead man by using his daughter. That's not justice. That's cruelty dressed in silk and contracts." For the first time, his expression cracked. Something like regret flickered, then vanished. "You remind me of him," he said softly. "Your father. That same defiance. That refusal to see nuance." Claire laughed bitterly. "Nuance? Is that what you call this? You think orchestrating someone's life for vengeance is nuanced?" "It's survival," James said. "You think I made it to 72 by playing fair?" She turned toward the door. "Then maybe it's time someone else played back." He didn't stop her. As she left the room, she felt his gaze follow her like a hand pressing lightly against her spine. That night, she sat in the library, the journal open again beside her. The rage in his handwriting now felt colder, more precise. She knew she couldn't stay, but she also couldn't just walk away. Not yet. She called her former classmate Peter the next morning, framing her questions carefully. "Hypothetically," she said, "if someone signed a legal agreement under incomplete disclosure or emotional coercion, is it possible to have it voided?" There was a long pause. Then Peter said, "Hypothetically, yes. But it would depend on proof, intent, timelines, misrepresentation." "Claire, are you okay?" She hesitated. "Just working on a case study. Thanks." After the call, she began searching. Not just the old rooms, but the current ones. James's office when he was out, his drawers, files, digital folders. She needed evidence of pattern, of strategy. Something that proved she was more than just a last-minute solution. That he had targeted her because of who she was. What she found over the next few days chilled her. emails between James and his legal team months before they'd ever met, reports on her family, background checks, psychological profiles, medical records, even a scanned note from her late father, handwritten and desperate, pleading for a loan that had gone unanswered. She wasn't the first woman whose file he'd kept, but she was the first who'd signed. Claire printed everything, scanned what she couldn't take, hid it in her own folder encrypted on a flash drive she wore on a chain under her shirt. She watched the staff more closely, noting which ones looked at her with sympathy and which avoided her eyes altogether. Late one night, she found Mr. Harrow, the estate's head of operations, alone in the conservatory. He was watering the orchids with methodical care, the only man on the property who ever moved slowly. "Do you know what he's done?" she asked him quietly. Harrow didn't look up. "I know enough." "Then why are you still here?" He paused. "Because people like me don't always get to leave, Miss Reeves. Sometimes survival means silence." Claire nodded, more in understanding than agreement. But she wasn't built for silence. The next morning, she stood in James's study as he entered. She didn't wait for him to sit. "I know everything," she said, "about my father, about the documents, about the other women. I have it all." James's eyes narrowed. "And what do you plan to do with it?" "I haven't decided, yet." He moved behind the desk slowly. "You have no idea what game you've entered. I know enough to stop playing." He regarded her quietly. Then he said, "You remind me of someone else, too. My mother. She thought principle was more important than power. She died broke." Claire's hand curled around the edge of the chair. "And yet," she said, "she died free." He smiled, and for the first time it was genuine. "We'll see how far freedom gets you, Claire." She didn't respond. She turned and left the room, her footsteps echoing down the marble hallway. She had his secrets. Now she had to decide what to do with them. The air in the estate felt different now, as if the walls themselves had begun to sense the fracture forming inside them. Claire moved through the halls like a shadow, no longer tentative, no longer afraid to meet the eyes of the staff who watched her with quiet sympathy or careful avoidance. She wasn't just a guest anymore, nor merely a pawn in someone else's game. She was something else now, a threat, a disruption, an inevitable reckoning. James had not spoken to her since their confrontation in the study. The door to his wing remained closed. Meals were still served at 7, but he no longer waited at the head of the table. The chair sat empty, its shadow long across the polished wood. She ate alone. Sometimes the food remained untouched. Her appetite had disappeared in the wake of clarity, replaced by a sharp, steady resolve. She had the evidence. That part was no longer in question. The files, the correspondence, the quiet testimony of the estate's head of operations, Harrow, who had confirmed what she already suspected. Claire was not the first, only the most legally convenient. But that wasn't enough. She needed more. She needed to show that James Kingsley's obsession had crossed the line between retribution and exploitation. And she needed help to do it. She reached out to Peter again, this time without the pretense of hypotheticals. They met in the back room of a bookstore just off campus, a place thick with dust and books too old to be stolen. Peter listened silently as she laid everything out. The contract, the deception, the documentation. When she was done, he didn't speak right away. Instead, he flipped through the printed pages slowly, his brow furrowed. "You have enough to launch a case," he said at last, "but you'll need to go public. This isn't just legal. It's reputational. You'll be going after a man with more lawyers than most countries. Claire nodded. "I'm ready." "Are you?" he asked, more gently than she expected. "Because once this starts, there's no walking it back." "I already walked past the point of return the day I signed his name into mine," she said. Peter leaned back. "We'll file a preliminary injunction. Start there. If he retaliates, it'll be on record." Retaliation came sooner than she expected. The morning after the paperwork was filed, Claire found a note slipped beneath her bedroom door. The paper was thick, embossed with the Kingsley crest. The handwriting was James's, steady, precise. "If you insist on dragging this into the open, be prepared to lose more than you gained. You're not the only one who knows how to weaponize the truth." She read it twice, then set it aside without a flinch. There was no more room in her body for fear. Not of him, not of what he could do. The legal summons arrived 3 days later. James had filed for dissolution of contract citing breach of confidentiality. But it was a diversion, meant to delay, not to defeat. Claire and Peter responded with a counterclaim, submitting the evidence she had gathered. False pretenses, fraud, emotional coercion, malicious intent. The case began to draw whispers in legal circles. Anonymous blog posts, discreet calls from reporters who had questions they were too careful to ask directly. Then came the subpoena for Harrow's testimony. It was a gamble. He could have refused, cited confidentiality, claimed ignorance. But he didn't. He appeared in a small hearing room with hands folded behind his back and eyes steady beneath the scrutiny. His voice was low but clear. He spoke of patterns, of orders carried out without context, of watching other women come and go, of background checks prepared before any meetings took place. He never used the word trap, but the implication was undeniable. When he stepped down, Claire met his gaze with a quiet nod. He didn't return it, but she felt the tremor of something like respect ripple between them. James didn't attend the hearing. Instead, he sent a legal proxy, a sharp-eyed woman with a briefcase that snapped like a threat. She argued contract law with surgical precision, but even she couldn't erase the paper trail. She couldn't undo the signed letters, the emails, the financial transfers that predated Claire's consent. Still, the court moved slowly. It always did. Justice had never been swift, but something else had changed. James Kingsley's name had begun to rot in the press. The whispers had turned to accusations. Business associates pulled out of ventures. Foundations revoked donations. The fortress he'd spent decades building began to crack, not from lawsuits, but from silence, from absence, from the slow erosion of a legacy that had been too dependent on secrecy. Claire didn't celebrate. She couldn't. It wasn't over. Not yet. She returned to the estate one final time, not because she had to, but because she needed to see it again with clear eyes. The place looked smaller now, less mythic. The shadows no longer clung to the walls like threats. The rooms no longer hummed with secrets. She moved through them like someone sifting through the bones of a memory. In the foyer, she found another envelope. This time it bore no seal, no address. Inside was a letter in James's hand. "I underestimated you. That is my error. You weren't supposed to be curious. You weren't supposed to be clever. You were meant to accept the trade and enjoy the spoils. But you reminded me, unfortunately, that not everyone follows the script they are given. I won't fight you anymore. Not because you've won, but because I'm tired. You were right about one thing. Revenge is not legacy. It's rot dressed as righteousness. You deserve more than to carry that forward. I've instructed my attorneys to transfer the estate into your name. Do with it what you will." Claire read it twice, then folded it carefully and slipped it into her coat pocket. She didn't stay the night. The next month passed in paperwork, settlement, restructuring. The estate was sold in a quiet private transaction. The proceeds covered her family's remaining debts, her mother's medical expenses, her sister's future. What remained went into the formation of a foundation, named not after the Kingsleys, but simply after her father. Not to honor him, but to close a loop. Claire returned to school that fall. Not to medical school, but to law. She'd seen what it meant to be bound by contracts, to be silenced by signatures. She wanted to help others reclaim what they were told they'd forfeited. One morning, a year after the trial, she received a package without a return address. Inside was a single object, the key she had found in the locked room. No note, no explanation. Just the key, warm from the velvet pouch, still heavy with everything it once unlocked. She placed it in a drawer and never opened it again. Claire stood on the steps of the legal aid office she had helped open, watching as a mother and her daughter walked out with fresh papers and lighter eyes. She felt the wind shift around her, lifting her hair from her face. Somewhere behind her, the past still echoed, but faintly now like footsteps down a hallway she no longer had to walk. She closed her eyes and let it go. The gold she had been promised had meant nothing, but the freedom she had carved from its ruins, that was hers, and it always would be. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and stick around for the next chapter. There's always more to uncover.